So I am here with one of the, perhaps the most preeminent social scientists in Singapore's history. I mean, he was teaching and he was researching and writing about Singapore's social sciences before I was born. So as an undergrad, I was reading his pieces, and now as a professor, I'm assigning his pieces to my students. So I am extremely delighted. Welcome everyone to episode 87 of Teh Tarik with Walid. With me is the legendary Professor Chua Beng Huat, and he has a book written recently, his 8th book, I believe. Is that? Yeah. So it's about, and it's basically back to his original roots when he was really in HDB and really discussing housing policies in Singapore. So the title is Public Subsidy Private Accumulation, the Political Economy of Singapore's Public Housing. Please get this. It's very affordable by NUS Press and written in an extremely accessible manner as well. So Prof Chua, thank you for being here. And my first question is, let's talk about the book. So why this book? What are the key arguments and why does it matter? Why now in 2024?
I have been working on public housing issues for maybe 30 years since I was in the housing board. And at the HDB, I was the director of social research. The job was to actually look at how Singaporeans use public spaces in the housing estates and also in the flats that they lived in. So since then, I've been sort of following, developments in the public housing, national public housing program, right? And I have actually written quite a few pieces in academic journals on as the public housing policy develops over the years. So there need to be a point in which all the pieces somehow get put together for a more coherent statement. And so what happens is during the COVID lockdown, I decided to do that. So within the 3 months lockdown, I basically wrote the first draft fairly quickly. Then, subsequently just took several months to tidy it up. So the timing is not particular. It's just that it is
so it has nothing to do with the upcoming elections. Oh.
Not really. No, not. But I mean, I think that it's kind of interesting because housing was already a kind of politicized issue in 2011, if you remember. Yeah. And in 2011, the opposition parties had made affordability a political question during the election. And in that particular election, the PAP also lost the most seats and also garnered the lowest popular vote in its history. And then immediately after that, a new Minister of National Development, and it was put in place. And he radically changed some of the housing policy at the time, right? So it was already a political issue since 2011. And I think that it's all, since then, this worry about affordability has never actually gone away. And then post-COVID, because of the delay in the project completion and so on, the pressure, is very high in terms of demand, right? So as you know, HDB resale prices hasn't actually come down since the lifting of the COVID. In fact, today's paper say it has still been rising for the last 8 months. So I think that it's going to be a perennial issue. Whether it gets politicized or not will depend on the context, I think. Yeah.
Right. So that's interesting because you said that Coburn won, right? So he radically changed. But how much radical change can happen given the circumstances? I felt like Mabautan was sort of a fall guy in some ways, right? Because isn't the issue ultimately about the making public housing an asset? Isn't that the fundamental problem, or what do you think?
I think that, part of the problem in 2011 was that the construction of public housing slowed down very radically under Mabautan at the time. And HDB used to always build in advance and in anticipation of demand. So they build ahead of time.
Right.
But during Mabautan's days, the idea of the build to order was introduced, because somewhere around 2005 or somewhere around there was a period in which there was an overhang of housing that was not taken up. That was already completed, not taken up. So that creates that kind of caused the HDB to rethink about building in anticipation of demand, right? So they then introduced the BTO. So now it's completely BTO, right? And that's kind of rationalized the production pipeline. So and then part of the problem, because of the underbuilding, that's when the prices actually went up radically. And suddenly there's this question of affordability. But I think that affordability is not really a problem. Although the quantum in terms of price, right, is now very high, is now relatively high. But I think the HDB, and when we're talking about HDB, we're also talking about the government, right?
Yeah.
Because HDB and the government is practically synonymous, right? So I think they have managed to keep monthly mortgage to about between 25 to 30% of monthly income within each bracket, and that's actually practically global standard. In fact, better than a lot of cities, right? Because when we talk about Singapore housing, we need to think in terms of cities and not in terms of nations. Because in the case of Malaysia, for example, right, there's always land to build, whereas in Singapore, land is very limited. So we are talking about confining to city limits and not the ability to continuously sprawl into suburb. Right? Yeah, so I think the part of the ability to keep the prices within 25 to 30% is the government providing increasingly more and more cash grants to new homeowners to enable them to get into the ground floor, so to speak, right?
So that's interesting. So two things I wanted to say. So one, your analysis I think is spot on, right? Economically, like cities versus nations, but politically and electorally, for voters that may not matter, right? Because this is our nation. We don't care whether we just want to see affordable houses, and relates to the other thing also about perception, right? So you're right that 25 to 30%, that's extremely reasonable, actually, right?
Yeah, by global standards.
By global standards, they're extremely reasonable. But that's not the only metric that people use, right? People will see, $1 million. So that metric maybe matters more in their minds, even if they may not be paying 1 million or upfront, when actually it's more affordable. But don't you think politically it has a bit more complexities?
Yeah, actually, I think the ability to profit from the ownership of public housing, right, was already built into the system by middle 1970s.
Right.
Before 1973, you had to sell the flat back to the HDB. Okay, the HDB actually started building in 1961, right? So for the first 10 or 15 years, you have to sell the flat back to the HDB. So there was no secondary market. But but from middle 70s onwards, that what we now call the resale market was developed. And it was developed actually as a result of fairly good intention, because the idea is that as family grows in, size, right, the spatial need goes up in the home, right? So the idea is to allow families who bought smaller flats to upgrade to a bigger flat, when the demand for space increases, right? And so that's why they were then allowed to sell it in the market, make some profit to help them to upgrade to a bigger flat, right? So the intention is actually for upgrading, right? But the moment you introduce a resale market, the flat changes from being a welfare good provided by a social housing to a commodity, right? To a commercial commodity. And in that, the profit angle is built in, right? So when a family sells a flat and make the profit, they either keep the profit or they pay for upgrade, or they use it to upgrade. When they upgrade, they're also increasing their housing wealth. So either way, you are actually improving the wealth of the family that sold the flat in the resale market, right? So the profit is that profit possibility already built into this, the idea that you can buy 2 subsidized flats, one at a time, right? And Singaporeans know this. That's why it's commonly said you get 2 bites of the cherry, right? And so in a sense, the profit making is always quietly there until the $1 million flats. The $1 million flats brings out this issue in a way, raises a public question that it made explicit something that is already happening, right? And the number of $1 million flats is actually quite small percentage, right? Like it's only 1 or 2%. But as you say, the symbolic impact is huge, because the iconic case of the Pinnacle, right? Young professionals buy in within after 5 years minimum occupancy period, walks away with $500,000, right? And that's when in a certain sense, the outsized profit starts to offend public sense of justice and fairness, right? So actually the $1 million flat attracts more symbolic impact than real financial issue, right? And so the good thing that comes out of that is that the government finally decide to act on the profit question, right? Because now we have this new category of housing called, prime, plus, and standard, right? And in the prime case, the condition of ownership is much more stringent, right? It's 10 years minimum occupancy. So, in a way, so I think that the symbolic impact was high, and it offended the public sentiment, and the government has acted. So whether that will actually take out some of the it's not maybe moral outrage, we'll wait and see, because it's just introduced, so even the first prime flat hasn't been sold.
So was it a mistake to change it from a welfare good to a commodity, or philosophically at least, the moment you had the idea that this could potentially be an asset? Do you think that was when public housing no longer became public housing? Or
Well, I mean, in a way that this is really an impossible question in retrospect, right? Because in a way that if first of all, 99-year lease, right, is really long-term lease, meaning it's still renting, okay? So you really, when we talk about, HDB ownership, it's ownership in the sense that the leaseholder is permitted to transfer the lease as a commodity. But in principle, the flat and the land actually belongs to the government, right? So in a way, you are just paying rent. But the opportunity, because it's a long-term lease and you can transfer in the secondary market, and as I said earlier, it allows you to make profit. Whether the population should be renting permanently, that's a really tough question. Right. I think it wouldn't have worked in any case, because people think of renting as a continuous drain on their income, whereas ownership of property is, property is not just has a use value, right, in the sense that you live in it, but it's always also an investment good. And if you have 80% of the population being deprived of a prime investment good, the economy, we don't know what kind of shape it will be, right? So you can't, and the idea is that by selling 99-year lease, right, is that you paid it in one go, okay? So it's written like a mortgage, like a regular mortgage, right? That actually is fairly important to the national economy, because as you know, right, housing is paid for through CPF, which is a very large savings, right? Even with a lot of money taken out for housing, there's still a very large savings left that is invested through the GIC, right? So actually, having public housing ownership takes a lot of cash out of the system. If that cash is not taken out, the inflation rate will be crazy. Because we import everything we use, right? And if we are awash with all this cash chasing goods, right, inflation will be, phenomenal. Plus the fact that a lot of the hard work capital gains will be outflowing because we import the goods we use. So it's impossible to actually answer the question that in retrospect, because the impact on the national economy we will have a completely different kind of economy.
Right.
Yeah.
So the 2011 elections featured very prominently in your book, and I think your book, I mean, is excellent for many reasons, but one of the ways it really brings housing as a political issue, right? As an electoral political issue.
Yes.
So, and 2011, that was the first time I was voting, and I remember I was just very angry at the government, and the number one reason was housing.
Right.
And I was thinking, I was about to get married, and it seems like this is incredibly high, the prices. Now, as a person who has already bought the house,
you have benefited.
Now, if suddenly the guy say, okay, let's go back to cost price, right? Then, so basically, there's no way to not alienate a large chunk of people, no matter what the policy is, right? So is this the biggest political problem for the PAP in the near future?
I think that the political consequence of housing issue, right, as I said in the book, is because the HDB has essentially monopolized housing provision for the whole country, except for the top 15-20% by now who lives in private sector, right? And we don't have squatter areas.
Yeah.
And because the government owns effectively all the land except for the 15% freehold land, right? So given that there are no alternative to housing for 80% of the population, right? There's a total dependency of the population on the HDB. And that total dependency means that at any one time, the HDB fails to provide for whatever reason, whether it's COVID or, recession or whatever. The moment the HDB, for some reason, is unable to provide for those who are in need of housing, it will become a political issue. Because, as we said earlier, HDB and the government is synonymous, right? So the failure of the HDB is then taken out as a failure of the government itself, right? And if there was an election in the offing, it's likely to be reflected in a decline of popular vote for the government. And that's quite evident in 2011, and even more so in the case that I mentioned in 1981 when the PAP lost Anson constituency to JB Jeyaretnam, right? Because at the time, the residents on Bear Plain was affected by the expansion of the PSA. The Ports of Authority of Singapore was expanding its containerization facilities, and it basically had to, take back the land on which they had built housing for their workers, for rental for their workers. And the Minister of National Development at the time refused to provide resettlement priorities to the affected household. And as a result, the affected household voted against the PAP during the by-election because Devan Nair, the MP, had become the president. So the seat became empty, right? And, they elected Jeyaretnam and JB Jeyaretnam for the first time. So we have instances already, to show that whenever the HDB, for whatever reason, fail to provide, then it will become a political issue.
Right.
And it will affect the popularity level.
Well, what about this coming election? Because it seems to me like the PAP has realized that this is potentially consequential for this upcoming one. So in my house, the lift at my house, it's all how HDB is affordable, you see, which is a bit strange. Like if it's affordable, you don't have to tell people, right? So do you think this coming election, the PAP has done enough to ensure that this is not, the issue is not solved, but it's not a deal breaker for people?
I think that if the government, they have done a number of things, right? One is actually to reclassify housing, right? In the case of, that's kind of aimed at, so sort of not quite the solution, but actually softening the outsized profit issue, right? So they have done that. And they've also actually controlled prices fairly well in a way because of this additional stamp duty bits, right? Because public housing flat prices is actually also tied to private housing. So they have actually controlled private housing. The
15 months also, they cannot.
Yeah, and also the 15 months delay for people who sold private housing to buy into HDB. And supposedly that's the group that is really paying the $1 million, right? Because they just sold their private housing with a lot and they're flush with cash. So they're willing to buy the larger flats in there. Yeah. And also they have pushed out a lot of flats.
Yeah.
So that the waiting queue has now been shortened from 5-6 years to the more normal sort of 3 to 4 years. So, and they've also increased cash grants for both new housing and resale flat. in fact, buying a resale flat now gets a lot more grant than buying a fresh flat, right? So they've done a lot. And then, now, of course, they've also speed up upgrading of older housing estates. So yeah, I mean, I think they're preparing, they are anticipating housing to be potentially a politicized issue. And they have done a lot before that happens. So depending on the runway, I mean, if the election is in 2025 and not sometime closer than that, the effect may actually be ameliorated sufficiently.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
What if it's, let's say if it was tomorrow, like hypothetically?
I think if it was tomorrow, it's still unclear to me. I think because I think that even with the rising prices have been slowing down a lot, and we actually haven't seen a lot of public outcry. Although there's, in the media daily there's reporting of HDB prices going up and down and new places opening up. And then now, introducing public housing to, the sort of privileged enclave of Bukit Timah, right? I mean, that's not going to happen until 20 years from now, right? But they're already announcing it now, prior to, way before it's going to get started. So I don't think that it's hard to say. I think partly because the number of people, right, in the existing flats way exceeds. So that means the electorate is disproportionately already flat owners like you. Right. And the new entrance is a relatively small number.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And so if the parents of the new entrants are not too anxious, that actually, will reduce the problem, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So numerically, it's not really a big issue, I think.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So numerically, so definitely, I think because most of the electorate are not new entries,
yes,
or new entrants. But what about, let's explore the sense of justice that you mentioned earlier, right? So do you find this, and you've been observing politics for the longest time, even you've been teaching at NUS for many years. Do you see this sense of justice thing as something particularly different? Because sometimes we jump the gun. Every generation we say is different from the previous generation, right? But in GE 2020, did we witness something different? Sashi Jayakumar, he mentioned in his book that was the first time where a sense of justice by the younger voters actually, because what the PAP did, they have been doing for the longest time, right? Being harsh towards the opposition, but for the first time it was punished. So do you see that the 1 million flat thing flying in the face of Singaporeans because of that? Because there is a new sense of justice that matters slightly differently for younger voters than older ones.
I think that the issue, I mean, the thing is that in principle, right, the opportunity is available to everyone, right? Technically speaking, right? Everyone who owns a public housing flat is able to capitalize on it as an asset. But of course, the opportunity in principle is there, but in practice, is unequally distributed, right? So as I said in the book, that only, in fact, is the higher income, higher middle class in the HDB population, right, that is able to benefit from the buying and selling of flats, right? And in that way, increase either their cash wealth or housing wealth, right? So in that sense, that's why the title of the book, right, is the public subsidy that is supposed to be socially redistributive has in fact become an instrument for private accumulation of wealth. And not only that, has become an instrument by which wealth inequality have actually increased rather than narrow, right? So that is that is where the irony of subsidy is, right? Where it's supposed to be redistributive, it in fact had the opposite effect of intensifying inequality. And where that in a way is a question of whether people perceive that as a social justice issue is unclear, because, one of the interesting things ideologically is that people don't always blame their lack of opportunities on themselves. I mean, they always blame it, often they blame it on themselves rather than on structural problem. You see what I mean? It takes quite a lot of education to understand that your individual situation is not a result of your own misfortune or lack of intelligence or whatever, right? But it's a result of economic and social structure. It takes quite a lot of education to do that. I mean, unless you're in, university social science, right? So people who, even if they see other people buying, being able to capitalize on $1 million flat, they're not really necessarily envious of that. They're not necessarily feel unjust of that, as long as they feel that it's their own fault that they are not there.
Right.
Okay? So, and that is generally the case, so that even when we're looking at the relatively poor population, often they will say, I'm not as poor as the next person, right? So in that sense, I don't see that necessarily translate into the determining issue of how one votes. It may be one of the several considerations, but I think the primary consideration will still be the electorate's own disposition in the way they decide. Right?
So that's interesting, right? So if I could push you a little bit, Prof. So you have been writing about inequality for the longest time, right? Since 1990s, before that, right? So, and I agree with you. I think generally when I was growing up, the belief in meritocracy was unflinching.
Yes.
If you didn't succeed, that's because you didn't work hard. You see so many poor people, they succeeded because they work hard.
Exactly.
But in the past 5-6 years, do you think that's changed, right? I mean, Prof Yoyan's book became a bestseller because partly it spoke to the hearts of Singaporeans. Is there a shift there? That meritocracy is not as strong as last time?
I think that the sense of, I think Yoyan's book is really important in that, she actually raised the public consciousness and, more importantly, the conscience of the public about poverty. Okay? Because, in fact, I would say that it's only after her book came out that inequality became a very noisy public issue. Before that, it's there, but there was never a big question. And I think, her book is really important because it, as I say, is not just empirical, but it's also the conscience that we are a rich nation and we do have in our midst, this 5 or 6% of real poverty, and not relative poverty, but actually real poverty, right? And so, and which is why, the book sold thousands of copies, which is great. So there is a recognition of that, but that doesn't mean that there is therefore giving up the idea of meritocracy. It just means that, and I think that the government's position is at least now recognizing that competition begins at early childhood, right? So they're introducing kindergartens for low income, reserving seats in the public school for low income. So that is finally being addressed, right? So there's that. The other thing is that I think that the problem with meritocracy is, in practice, after so many years, right, the fear is that it's getting more and more difficult to break either your poverty line or your working class line, right? And so education still is the means towards upward mobility, but you can't if you don't have meritocracy, you would then have even a worse system, because you would then need a bureaucracy to allocate opportunity, which is subjected to huge amount of corruption possibility,
indeed.
right?
Yeah.
So the meritocracy is not so much to me, meritocracy as a problem is not at the beginning point. I mean, as long as, the government is able to bring up, sort of narrow the gap of the starting point, right? If you think of meritocracy as the allocation of resource and not as a consequence of result, okay, then it's quite a different way of thinking, okay? Because with the allocation of resources, if you don't have some kind of meritocracy system, you're going to have a potentially highly corrupt administrative allocation, which is part of the collapse of socialism, right? But the result, you need to deal with the severe inequality of results, right? And that is where that is where I think something needs to be done. And this idea that continuously trying to persuade those who are able and those who are successful, right, to remember their success is also dependent on collective contribution, and they should do good. I mean, that's a moral persuasion, but whether that will, happen or not is really difficult to say. But I think that at the government level, there has been a lot of increase in social transfer, right? And in the so quite effectively has brought down Gini coefficient from about 0.43 or 4 to somewhere around 0.38. That's substantial, right? Yeah. So actually, in spite of the government's insistence that we are not a welfare state, we are in fact distributing a lot of money.
Right. And that was where I wanted to go actually. So it's almost as if you read my mind. But I wanted to just briefly touch on the bureaucracy thing as well, because sometimes, especially dealing with HDB, right? Sometimes it's really, you almost feel like, hey, are these bureaucrats heartless or something? But actually that rigidity, even though it's frustrating, it really lessens the room for discretion and corruption, right? So there's a lot of wisdom in the rigidity. So of course, we still want them to be a bit more flexible. So the idea of the non-welfare ideology, which you said that is a PAP stated ideology, that's a thing of the past, right? Because we are moving more leftwards economically, and there's no way that the 4G and PM Lawrence Wong can move economically rightwards, right?
Well, I mean, in a way, is interesting, like historical, right? Because if you think of the public housing system, it's actually, the beginning is extremely socialist, right? The nationalization of land, right? The universal provision, housing being dealt with as necessity at a very, a very low cost, right? So, but somewhere in the middle 1970s, Lee Kuan Yew actually publicly changed his mind from a more social democratic welfare state to a lesser one, because he went to Hong Kong and he saw the Hong Kong population working really hard with the colonial government providing nothing. So he came back and decided that, in order to motivate Singaporeans to work harder, that the government should cut back on provision. But the thing is that was only possible because we were also a relatively young population. And we didn't have problem like, aging population, expanded welfare system. And we were, building only primary school. We don't have unemployment issue. And, the economy was expanding very rapidly, right? So actually, the ability to actually so-called be anti-welfarist really is historically contingent on the fact that we were a young population. But now that we are facing super aging population, right? The cost of maintaining social welfare of the people has gone up,
Right.
and the government has to proportionally spend on social spending. So I think no society can actually avoid welfare. How much welfare is needed is in some sense dependent on demographic dividend. Right? If you are a young population, your healthcare costs go down a lot. So for the longest time, the education budget in the national budget exceeds the health budget. Right? For the longest time, apart from, defense has always been the most expensive item. After that was for a long time, education is even higher than housing and development. Right. But now, social spending exceeds education spending because we don't have to build as many primary schools anymore. Because, in fact, primary schools are closing down for lack of students, right? So I think if we look at welfare, right, we forget the rhetoric. The rhetoric is still that we are not a welfare state, right? Forget the rhetoric, but you look at the actual expenditure, we are moving towards more and more provision, right? And we will develop, we actually do, to my mind, we actually have a minimum wage. Yeah. It's just we don't want to call it that.
We don't want to call it because the opposition started it, right?
Well, also,
because it's against the welfare idea.
Because it's just a matter of term. Right?
Yeah. We do.
Because the work, supplement, where income supplement is where the minimum wage actually, lies, right?
Indeed. So am I right to say that since the demographics will just move in that direction of our low fertility rate, we will just see more movements to the left economically?
Well, whether you call it left or not, we will become more and more need of supporting, not just the aged, but because of the disruption of employment by machines, right? We will also have to provide a lot more support for the periods of unemployment. Whether you call it unemployment insurance or not, it doesn't matter. The support will be needed, and it already is in place. Right?
Thank you. So I wanted to pick your brain a little, right? So because meritocracy, as you said, is still a counter to corruption of bureaucracy and so on. So how do we refine it? Would you consider class-based affirmative action, which we sort of have in terms of, right? In public housing, we sort of have that already. So would you extend that concept to other areas like education?
I think it already happens in education because the government the Ministry of Education has now taken on providing kindergarten, which they never did before, right? And preschool and kindergarten is very expensive when it's in privately run. I know for a fact that if you were sending your 3-year-old to 6-year-old, right? 3 to 6 is preschool and then kindergarten, right? Before primary school, right? For those 4 years, it will cost you something like at least $1,000 a month. Okay. And you have to pay 12 months and not just during. So it's $48,000 just for those 4 years. It's more expensive than go to NUS.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's madness.
So private, private preschool is very expensive. So the government has now built, preschool into primary schools, right? And has in fact reserved, I think, 40% of those places to low income. So in a way, that is, that is sort of already introducing, ameliorating the sort of disadvantaged position for the working class kids, right? So it is already happening in terms of trying to ameliorate the effect of meritocracy.
It's just that we, of course, don't call it.
We will not.
We will not.
Rhetoric. That's why I think it's important to just put aside the rhetoric because I don't know why But we just don't want to call ourselves a welfare state.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're doing a lot of welfare.
Yeah, I think increasingly so. Yeah, so there's a question. Yeah.
Hi, Prof Chua. How much do you think the government will have to give up, financially or politically or in any way, to remedy the HDB time bomb?
Okay. So how much does the government have to give up politically or financially to remedy the HDB time bomb? You know, the 99-year list, like by the time you reach 50 years, what's going to happen?
You know, this is it's not, the issue is political, not really financial. Okay, the issue is political in the way that, theoretically speaking, as I said earlier, right, 99-year lease is a lease.
Yeah.
The property belongs to the government. You are renting, right? And so the end of 99 years, just like you're leasing a car for a week, at the end of the week, it goes back to the owner, right? So technically it should go back to the government. But of course, that becomes a political issue because people will be reluctant to accept that whatever investment they have put into the house is now zero value, right? So that's one problem. The other problem is actually much more intractable, is that most people will not live in the flat for 99 years. Yeah. Okay? So in a block, so when we're talking about 99 years, we're really talking about the age of the block and not really the 99-year lease. Because within that block, there are people with different lengths of lease left. Okay? So how to manage that? It's a nightmare. And I don't actually think that there is a solution in that sense. Okay? So the you know, now senior minister, the former Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had already introduced this idea of voluntary select and en bloc, right? Which means the suggestion is that when the block of building reaches 70 years, then there will be a referendum conducted among the residents, right, to see if they will agree to the demolition of the block and then being resettled, right? If there were 75 or 70 to 75% agreement, the block will be demolished. The residents will be resettled with priority into new housing, right? So that's a technical solution possible. And the government can do that easily because knocking down the block and it's okay because it then land banks, right? It keeps the land. Yeah. And likelihood the land actually will improve in value in the future, right? So that's not a problem. Okay. The problem will be the replacement cost for the resettlement may actually be an issue. And we already saw an instance of that 2 years ago in the case of Ang Mo Kio, right? Where the affected households are unable to actually pay for the new flats without heavy top up, right? And they don't have the money. So it was possible to solve that point, the Ang Mo Kio case, because there's only 3 blocks in but when you reach 99 yearly, there could be a whole generation of flats. We're talking about thousands of flats built approximately in the same period, right? It's a nightmare. So we don't know the solution. I mean,
so now he's just kicking the can down the road.
No. I mean, I think that the runway is still very far. So you know, so you can, you know, I mean, the HDB looks very far ahead in terms of because these problems are already visible, okay? They are not like unknown. They're actually problems known. Yeah. The question is how to manage a solution, and there might be several solutions needed and not a single one to solve all. Just like trying to help retirement households to recover the investment, right? there are several possibilities: downgrade, lease buyback, rent out a flat. So there can be several solutions that are putting in place depending on the conditions of each residence.
Right. So is part of the problem also, for at least a segment of Singaporeans, right? It's also about expectations, right? Again, when I was growing up, there was an expectation. If you got to uni, right, you'll be able to drive a car, you'll be able to live in a corner quite comfortably, right? That is gone, right? That expectation is not a guarantee at all now.
But that might not also be the same expectation. I think my hope is actually the younger generation will be post-materialistic. That they don't aspire to own a car because the awareness of the environmental issue is so much higher among the young. They're not, my son doesn't want to buy a car. I mean, if he needs a car, he will rent for a day. Otherwise, he just use public transport, right? And he's not aspiring to own a private home on the ground.
Right.
I mean, so I think the same kind of definition of what is the good life would hopefully have changed radically to more and more global consciousness rather than this kind of accumulative sense of what is a good life.
Do you see that in your experience in NUS, seeing students, young generations of young people, over time they get more and more globally conscious, socially conscious?
I think that among the students, I think there's less and less sense of the need to accumulate the material things, right? And I think there's a lot more willingness to actually do things for themselves rather than including not worried about long-term employment, but being able to cope with short-term gigs and stuff like that, as long as it's meaningful. I think that I think the idea of being materialistic is a lot less. I think each generation is less and less materialistic that way.
Okay. And that's for the better, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so just one final question before I ask you to share your thoughts, final thoughts. So over there will be many more writings from you. So how does this particular one fit in with what you have written about? Do you see this as a continuation of some of the things you have written about, or is this something different, or is this going back to how you started?
Well, I don't think I will write on housing issues for a while, because I think that I think the book basically covered the fundamental problems in the system. I think the contradictions in the system, right, I've dealt with. I think the future developments are, to me, sort of contingent type things, which comes and goes. So I don't actually see radical changes in the housing system. And not only that, I think that even if an opposition party comes into power, they are stuck with the same housing issue.
I agree.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the future work will be away from housing, but it will be more on political ideology, not just for Singapore, but I've always been told that I don't write about Asia. So I think it's time to write about Asia.
Is that fair though? I mean, you've written quite a bit about Singapore, and
I mean, I always think that, I have quite wide reading knowledge about Asia, but I don't think I never felt quite enough depth to actually,
right. Okay.
do that.
Okay. So there is a question from the.
This is not a question, just one of the listeners of your books, especially liberalism.
Okay, so liberalism disavowed is popular with the commenters. Yeah. So that was interesting, and I think also the way you right, I think Prof Yuyan, even Chiran George, it's not like, you know, a lot of academic writing is pompous and pretentious, and it's more about showing a person's brilliance rather than reaching out to the reader. I think the way that you guys write, I think it's very accessible, and a lot of people really appreciate that. So so final question, Prof. So let's say a PM Lawrence Wong meets you, right, and Mr. Desmond Lee and meets you. Prof Chua, tell us what should we do for HDB before the next elections? What should we do? What should be our angle?
I'm not sure that they can. I mean, I'm not. You see, the thing is, it's a fairly big system, right? And it's not. You know, I mean, we're always focusing on the price question all the time, right? And you know, I mean, in a way, like all commodities, the government is in fact reacting to market. It is not, in spite of the fact that HDB produces new flats, right? And so in principle can control the price. But it doesn't really, okay? Because the pricing of new flats must be relative to existing flats. So you can't radically price new flats cheaply.
Right, exactly.
Because if you do that, you will bring down the entire market.
And the people
And then
who
your
own houses would be so
and then
angry.
you'll be right up,
Yeah.
you know, and then you will jeopardize the investment of the existing flat owners. And as I said, that number far exceeds the new entrants, right? So you can't do that, right? So the price, so in that sense, the market controls the price and the HDB doesn't.
Right.
Okay. So what can the government do is, you know, effectively, in the book that I said is that the thing that the government can do is to keep patching issues that comes up. It's like an operating system in a computer. There's going to be some clever hacker who always finds some loophole, and then as soon as it's discovered, right, it'll have to be patched. It's just like the $1 million flats, okay? And hopefully at some point the whole thing doesn't collapse because of the weight of the patching. But I don't think that you could, I don't think there's a single line of advice that say, do this and we will be, you know, happily ever after. I don't think that's possible.
Thank you so much, Prof Chua. And if I retired half as productive as you, I would have considered myself an extremely capable and able scholar. Thank you so much, Prof Chua.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.